Thanks everybody for joining tonight. This is the Penn State Technology Club. I hope everybody is doing okay considering the pandemic. Tonight we have a special guest, Alyssa Miller, with her talk, Looks Like There's a Threat Model in My DevOps. So Alyssa, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and then you can take it from there?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I definitely appreciate it. As we're all kind of learning how to be remote, and obviously for World Campus, it's something you guys are a little more used to. But there's certainly it's my pleasure to be here and talking with you guys tonight. So a little bit just about myself. First of all, I am a hacker. I am a researcher. So what does that mean? Researcher, not so much in the academic sense of research per se. I'm not writing papers all the time or, working in, large labs, but I am spending a considerable amount of time on my own researching different security topics, different technologies, something I've basically been doing since I was 12 years old. So digging in, wanting to understand how technology works, wanting to deconstruct it, understand it better, and that turns into me speaking in various public settings, including webinars like this. I'm also a security advocate, and what I mean by that is kind of twofold. So first of all, again, getting out and sharing the message. One of the things I really enjoy in my job is getting out and talking with people, sharing ideas, talking about ideas I've had, talking about the research I've done, hearing what other people are doing, having them sometimes challenge my thoughts and ideas and sometimes challenging theirs too. But also when I say I'm a security advocate, that's actually my title now professionally. So I work for a company called Sneak, who's based in London, and I am an application security advocate, which means my role is to really get out in the security community and talk about application security topics. I'm also an author and a blogger. I am currently working on a book about how to start a career in cybersecurity. I do have my own blog site. I also blog for my employer. I do some other blogs for other organizations from time to time. And then finally, I am the co-host of a podcast called The Uncommon Journey, where we really dig into people within the security industry and what it is, how they got there, what their stories are, and really focusing on the many, many different ways that people can ultimately end up in a career in cybersecurity. So that's all about me. So as you saw from the title, we're going to talk about threat modeling tonight. And I always like to start with a little bit of a story about threat modeling because, threat modeling is something we've been talking about for years in the security space. And, I was doing some work with an organization when I used to work as a consultant. And this organization, they had a really good threat modeling process. So they had really streamlined it down. They had a really strong, repeatable, very efficient way in which they went about doing threat modeling. But threat modeling, as it tends to be, is still somewhat resource intensive, and it was for them. And it sticks in my head to this day, being in one of these threat modeling sessions as a consultant for this company. And as we're leaving the session, one of the developers comes up to me and he's telling me how he can't wait to not have to do threat modeling anymore, because in a couple months they were going to be shifting over to more of a DevOps and a CI/CD or constant integration, constant deployment model. And it kind of struck me. I looked at him and I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, DevOps and CI/CD, we can't do this threat modeling anymore. And so I started to really think about that. And indeed, as you developer communities in particular, or you have just within the security industry itself, the common theme is that people look at as this really heavyweight, intensive process that's just incompatible DevOps. So as we've gone to this idea of DevSecOps and trying to bring security X, threat modeling is one of those things that often we think about how do we automate dynamic assessments? How do we automate code reviews? How do we make sure our security configurations in are being addressed? But we kind of forget about threat modeling, and important aspect, and we'll talk a little bit more. But how did we get here? So, a number of years ago, Adam Shostak wrote this book, and it is probably the gold in terms of threat modeling guides. Been through a couple revisions. It's really stood the test of time. But as you read through the book, you start to realize that a lot of frameworks and different to threat modeling that do heavy-handed. So there's talk of the framework, which is a very technical focus on how do we categorize threats. It talks about creating data flow diagrams and threat vectors, and so you start to realize that threat modeling has an awful lot to it. And indeed, as we look around the we see all of these different frameworks and models and ideas that have you do threat modeling. So I mentioned Stride before, and upper right here. Some of the data flow diagrams that we're talking about. We started coming up with things like DREAD to classify this further, and isn't enough, so we added DREAD plus D because add detection there as well. And and then we had this thing called about, well, how are we going to track common so forth? And so someone came up with this whole idea of categorizing that, and you can see just how complex it can be for that. And so we're sitting here through the course of the 2000s and into the 20 teens, threat modeling in terms of a process like this. While in 2008, DevOps on the scene. So in Belgium get together, and this idea for how can we change the culture and speed things up, enable developers to do more. DevOps is the result. So as these big heavyweight ideas going to address security, and developers are talking about how do they get faster, they move things along quicker, how do they bypass that security's put in the way and happen quickly and be more responsive. And so we have the where suddenly now security seems compatible with this new highly dynamic, very speedy to market that's being codified in a DevOps culture. So we start talking SecOps, we're going to try to get security in. Then it becomes all about automation. And with DevOps already being all things within our delivery pipeline, sure, we're going to come with automated solutions for scanning, for doing dynamic assessment. But threat modeling kind of old. There's a few vendors who create automated tools to do it. The adoption of those automated less than stellar. It's a hard thing to do in an automated fashion. So how about we take a step back just for a minute? Let's actually look at why do we even, I said early on, threat modeling is kind of a crucial security practice, but why do we? And the thing is, no one answer to that. So ask the Open Web Application Security, OWASP. Many people are with OWASP. And ask them, okay, threat modeling? Why do we do it? What we long involved definition, right? And it says, threat modeling is activities for improving security, and thing to you, you can see how long it is. So I'm actually going to stop here. My mic is cutting out. That's the mic. Let me, that problem really. So okay. So hopefully that's better. I apologize for that. If someone wants to confirm.
I thought it was me.
Is that better now?
It sounds okay, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Apologize. I think I won't even get into the details. So in any event, so this is OWASP. OWASP gives you this really lengthy definition. Why do we do threat modeling? And you can see it talks about things like denial of service attacks and so forth, and it's really long and involved. But then if I move on and I ask instead, I'll go to Wikipedia. Everybody loves Wikipedia, and we all know if it's on Wikipedia, it's got to be true. So the purpose of threat modeling is to provide defenders with a systematic analysis of what controls or defenses need to be included. This one's getting better. Like, okay, we're starting to see a little bit more of the focus, but it's still really complex. Like, we're talking about how complex threat modeling is and how to make it simpler for DevOps. We can't even define what threat modeling is without big complex definitions. So let's go to Microsoft. Adam Shostak wrote that book. He used to work for Microsoft. Well, what do they have to say? Well, we shortened it a bit, but it's still kind of complex. Threat modeling is an engineering technique you can use to help you identify threats, attacks, vulnerabilities, and countermeasures that could affect your application. You can use threat modeling to shape your application's design, meet your company's security objectives, and reduce risk. Okay, well, what does all that really mean? It's a lot of words, but what are we really saying? So how do we simplify this? So I looked at the problem, right? And I really started to think about threat modeling. If I want to get threat modeling into DevOps, and I know that threat modeling right now is this big complex thing. Well, how do I deconstruct this? So I'm thinking again like a hacker, right? How do I break this down? How do I figure out how this works and make it work better? And when I started to think about it, what I realized is, okay, when we're talking threat modeling, really all threat modeling is, if you want a definition, what could possibly go wrong? That's the question we're trying to answer when we go about threat modeling. We're going to look at a system and we want to know what could go wrong with the system. So I found the definition that I like. Simply put, the reason for threat modeling is to identify the likely threats to a system to inform the design of security countermeasures. So now we can simplify it. We ask the question, what could possibly go wrong? And we ask that question so that as developers start developing their code, they know what they need to do from a security perspective to address the key threats. Now, where did I find that definition? Kind of had to make it up myself. But this was the result of a lot of time spent just brainstorming and really digging into how could we make threat modeling work. And the reality is, I can tell you today, it is possible, and that's why I'm here talking to you, to do threat modeling within a DevOps environment. So let's start to talk about how do we do this. Now, one of the key things you have to understand with DevOps is not a deployment model. It is not a delivery model. DevOps at its core, and I mentioned this before, is a culture change. The point of DevOps was to unite developers and operations into one cohesive unit where they shared responsibility for the full delivery of software to a production environment, or the full delivery of a product to a production environment. And so in order to support that culture, we needed to see changes in terms of technology. We needed to see changes to our processes, of course. So we saw all the automation. We saw that we changed how we approach development. Obviously, tools were needed and governance was a big part of it. But what we kind of forget about, we get so focused on a lot of those other areas. How do we technically make this happen? We kind of forget that the people are part of this too. And so as I start to look at how do we bring this together and how do we operate within this changed culture, we're going to see how we're going to expand beyond that idea of just DevOps or even beyond DevSecOps, and we're going to start to bring in some other individuals. So when we talked about threat modeling, one of the first steps to threat modeling traditionally was always creating this data flow diagram. It was getting a bunch of people in a room to talk about how the app worked, what all its structures were, where different data stores and functions and things lived, what kind of data they processed, how that data flowed through, where there were boundaries between trust systems, and so forth. This right here takes a lot of time. And it was typically done after complete design was already in place and development was oftentimes already underway. Sometimes development had to wait for these. But this is way too intense. It's not going to work with DevOps. So we're going to toss this away. Instead, we're going to go and we're going to extend this culture of shared responsibility now. From just developers and operations, or even developers, operations, and security, we're going to bring in the business people. Because what we want to do at the end of the day is we want to know what are the worst things that could happen. So if I'm going to ask, hey, I want to understand what could possibly go wrong, well, what are the worst parts of that? What are the things that I need to prioritize above anything else? And who better to give me that answer than the business people who actually understand the business context of what is going on within this application? So when I go to them, I want to understand from them, and I'm looking for them to capture for me, what are those critical areas? What are the things about this application that I need to understand? So let's start identifying those critical assets. Now, one critical asset is going to be private data. Certainly in the last 5 years, we've become very sensitive to this idea. We've seen data breaches. We've seen record numbers of different forms of user data exposed on the internet. We get that private data is important. So being able to recognize this is crucial. And private data has become an asset of sorts for different development initiatives and different products and so forth. But that's not our only asset. Literally, the critical functions of our application, of our product, are also crucial assets that we need to be aware of. And so you see, we're already starting to define assets in a very different way. They're not necessarily just traditional IT assets, but they're those, how does this pertain to the business? If I've got an IT asset that helps me deliver electricity to large, spans of the country, my asset from a business perspective is that ability to deliver that electricity. The IT asset is just something that supports it. Financial assets are a pretty obvious one. People assets, however, are another one that kind of gets forgotten about. We keep forgetting about people in all this. We get so focused on technology. So understanding that people are assets, and that part of what we have to do when we build products or we build systems is we have to protect those people. A great example of where this falls apart, for instance, where threat modeling would have been a great solution, is when we start thinking about the Internet of Things, or the way that we're interconnecting devices, and we're calling everything smart devices, but we kind of forget that we have users on the end of that we need to protect. The example I'm thinking of was most recently a Kickstarter that I saw for somebody who had created a self-lighting candle, where literally you could light the flame on a candle And we're talking a real flame here via your smartphone. But now if I do the threat model on that, that becomes pretty apparent really quick, the danger to people from that if that were to get compromised, or simply the app itself could light the candle, but it couldn't extinguish the candle. So that seems problematic here. So we have to be aware as we're creating systems, as we're creating process, that those people who are buying that, who are using the things that we're creating, are one of our assets as well. And then finally, there's the idea of secrets. Now, secrets is a nebulous term, and that's on purpose. It can refer to so many things. It could refer to trade secrets. We could break it down into technical aspects and start looking at secrets management within our application. So it could be things like passwords, hash values, you name it. All those API keys, whatever that we're looking to defend. But at a business level, what are the secrets that we're trying to defend? We want the business people to help us capture that. Now, once they capture that, normally what we would try to do is apply stride, because now we want to understand the threats in terms of technical implications. But I'm going to tell you now, we're going to do away with this. We don't need to understand that there's a threat to this private data through spoofing or through tampering. Not yet. All of these categories are great, and it's good to understand that. But what is really crucial to us is to understand, again, from a threat perspective, the threat isn't that somebody's going to spoof us. The threat is that someone's going to steal something from us. They're going to commit fraud with our system. They're going to potentially expose that private data or those secrets, or they're going to interrupt our business. Those critical functions that we rely on, whether it's delivering electricity, whether it's delivering healthcare. These are the things we need to be aware of. And so when we talk about business context, these are the things that actually matter from a threat perspective. These are the things that would go wrong within our system. How they're accomplished is a conversation down the road. But we need to just start here, because this is the information that's going to inform our developers. So I'm talking about having business people be a part of this. And I want to ask them to capture this information. Well, where do we capture this information, and why the business people? Well, as we think about threat modeling, and we think in terms of DevOps and not delaying development, not slowing it down, not being inhibitive to development, how do we do that? Well, we've been talking about push left in security for at least 15 years. How do we move earlier into the development cycle? Well, that's how we make things better. That's how we make things frictionless, essentially, for our developers, is to enable them and to put these things in their hands from early on in the development process. We've seen study after study that shows us, addressing security vulnerabilities is cheaper and easier the sooner it's done in the development life cycle. So if we can push this further left into that delivery pipeline, give developers the tools they need sooner, that's the goal. So when we think about threat modeling then, and we think about how do we push it left, where do we push left, how do we get it to a point that it's so far left that it doesn't inhibit development at all? Well, that point, that farthest left point that we go, it's the user story. This is why we want to engage the business people. Not only do they give us that business context, but they're the ones that are writing the user stories. So as a business person, whether I'm a product manager, whether I'm someone in a customer experience role, whatever it is, I'm the one that understands what that functionality, that new piece of this application is going to look like. And enabling this in the user story does a few things for us. First of all, it's the one point in that DevOps pipeline where essentially the clock is not ticking, right? So we create these user stories. They could be created all day, every day. It's not until a user story is taken from the backlog and a developer starts to develop on it, that now we have to worry about that timing. So it gives us an opportunity to go through some of these steps of threat modeling before that virtual clock starts to tick. Additionally, by doing it in user stories, we've now taken out all that heavy lifting of trying to map data flows across an entire application, trying to understand every threat that an application or a system faces. And instead, I can just focus on the idea of continuous improvement. So we're doing continuous integration, continuous development anyway, or excuse me, continuous deployment as part of a CI/CD pipeline quite often within DevOps. So why don't we address our security improvements the same way? Let's make them continuous. We're just trying to get better tomorrow than we are today. So if I make sure that I put this information into my user story, now I'm only focused on the content of that user story. Typically, user stories capture success criteria. They capture all sorts of different key elements that relate back to that user story, that desired functionality, that desired change. Let's add in, let's talk about our critical assets, and let's talk about the threats that are posed to those assets by this user story or within this user story. The last real advantage here is that by putting this in the user story, it's there ready-made for the developer. The developer takes that user story off the backlog, and now they have that context. So remember back to our definition of threat modeling, where we said that we're identifying those potential threats to the system in order to inform development. Well, now we've identified it early on. Those developers, at the moment they take the story from the backlog, they are enabled with that business context that they didn't have before. Now they understand in terms of what's most crucial to the business. We're no longer assuming that developers have that knowledge, but we're giving them that knowledge. And now as they move into building this out, which is their component in that DevOps pipeline, now they have that information and they can inherently design controls that fit. So we turn it over to the developers. Now it's their turn. Now, if this were traditional threat modeling, we've identified the threats, we've categorized them, we drew all these happy diagrams. The next step would be one of these. This is that attack chain. This is how does this progress from a threat to an attack against our systems. And indeed, most threat modeling methodologies call for these to be created, and this is also time consuming. But where we've enabled the developer with business context that they can now apply at a technical level, they no longer need these complex attack trees. They understand from the ability to see that critical asset in terms of the business. Now that's something that is more inherent to their knowledge. How do I defend that? What are the things that could possibly go wrong? So we're going to build that out for them as well. So we're going to get rid of these diagrams, first of all, because those diagrams don't help. But instead, what we want to do is we want to enable developers to design controls based on what they know of these critical assets. And really, we can break these controls down into 3 simple categories. So if they take their knowledge and they take each of those threats that's been identified against each of those critical assets within the user story, all they need to do now is apply 3 forms of countermeasure to each. First is some form of detection. So when we go out and we're thinking about security and we're thinking about trying to secure an asset, we need a detection defense, something that's going to specifically identify when there is an attack incoming. This could be something as simple as logs. This could be our authorization protocols, something in form of detection. The next is what we call mitigation strategies. So the mitigation strategies, this is how we create time and space. So I'm using here the the Star Wars metaphor of this shield around a Death Star as it was under construction in Return of the Jedi, right? The whole point of that shield was to give the Empire time to react to an incoming attack. And that's what they did. They were able to fend off the attack. They were able to launch a bunch of fighters to come and address that attack. And it gave them, that shield gave them that time for that reaction. We do the same thing in security. We want to establish those defenses that give us time to react. So maybe we can't be impenetrable, but what can we do to slow it down? And then finally, we have our active protection defenses. Those things that when an attack is detected, while we're sitting in our mitigation defenses, we want to launch those active countermeasures that will seek out and defend against those attackers on their way into our systems. And so as developers now, we have that ability. We understand if I've got this secret that I need to defend, I have the capability to do things like protect it with encryption. I have the ability to set up layers of defenses, to set up things like multi-factor authentication and all these security controls that become parts of that. If I can lay those out into these three categories and I implement those for each of those threats, I have now incrementally made my application safer than it would have been without threat modeling. And that is the point of what we do when we're trying to do threat modeling. So as I start to wrap up here, and I've intentionally left some time for questions here at the end, I'll leave you with this quote. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a source for this quote. It's one of those happy internet memes I saw, but the fact of the matter is we can't change what we're doing in terms of cybersecurity. We can't change the way that we engage with DevOps if we continue to try to do the same things that got us to where we are today. So we've always thought about security as this gate. Security was always that thing that stood in the way. How do you get to this point, we're going to evaluate you, then we're going to let you do some more work and development, then we're going to evaluate you again. We as security practitioners need to move away from that. That's part of this DevSecOps culture. It's really becoming a part of that pipeline. As DevOps continues to move the developers further to the right, if we keep pushing left, we can start to be a more integral part of what it is that we're doing within that culture and within those delivery pipelines. So the last thing I'll leave you with is an open invitation. I always am happy to interact with folks. Certainly would welcome you anytime reaching out to me via social media. You have my Twitter information here, my LinkedIn as well. Also my website, I did mention my blog and so forth. Normally this would be a great time to talk about upcoming speaking engagements, obviously in light of current health situations and pandemic response. Speaking is now more virtual than it was before, but certainly feel free to interact with me any of these ways. Like I said before, I am always open to hearing other ideas, having my thoughts challenged, being invited to talk about other people's ideas and potentially challenge theirs as well. So with that, I will say thank you. And, on behalf of myself and certainly my employer as well, I really appreciate Penn State and the World Campus in particular, and your tech club having me here today. And so I will open it up at this point if there are any questions.
I got maybe not a question, a thought, as I've been trying to think about kind of the conversation about where security belongs in terms of left or right. Like that in the conversation, it seems like we're thinking that it belongs at some specific point, we want to get it earlier. What about the concept of it belongs at every component of the infinity, right? That it's some component of that, not that it's considered at every single stage of the DevOps cycle, not that it belongs in any specific place, right? So I got a little stuck there thinking about, like, if I move it left, it belongs in some specific part of it, not the whole part of it.
Sure. So let's talk about that, because that's a good question, and I want to make sure that I actually clear that up. So when we've talked about push left, and like I said, that's a message that we've been doing in cybersecurity as long as I've been in it, which is 15 years.
Yeah.
Security always, from very early on was well established in production, right? We had monitoring. We watched how systems reacted. We knew when attacks were coming in, supposedly. Not always. Sometimes that was a problem, and it still is. But security in the production environment was kind of well entrenched. The problem was that wasn't enough, and we wanted to get earlier. So when we say push left, the thought isn't to abandon what happens on the far right when we're in production. It's to extend our reach. And so you're absolutely right. The goal ultimately, and especially when we start talking about this culture of shared responsibility within DevSecOps, the goal is to have security embedded in some way throughout that, just the same way as ops and dev are. So, we've seen, like I said, developers are pushing farther right. They were always very left. They created the software, then they kind of handed it off to a QA team, and then that QA team handed it off to an ops team. And when it went to ops, then security got involved, and that was kind of the model. Yeah. So, with things like containers and infrastructure as code and everything we're doing, we're seeing development push farther and farther right, because they are now defining the infrastructure on which their systems run. Operations then became a part of that and is responsible for now being part of what are we creating in terms of code that's going to be our infrastructure, as well as keeping it running day to day. So we want to see the same thing happen ultimately with security, that early on, security is, it's being executed by those business folks as they're doing this threat modeling. Then we see security being exercised by developers as they're taking that information and now building it into their code. They're following secure code practices. They're looking at their dependencies and those packages that they draw into their code, and are there vulnerabilities there? And then as it moves operationally, now we see those operational teams and the security team more and more involved in that day to day. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The goal here is that all aspects, development, security, operations, span that entire lifeline of that pipeline of that delivery model, so that we are plugged in start to finish, and so that all teams understand they have equal responsibility in the success of all three disciplines: development, operations, and security.
Do you think it's fair to say that, and I don't know, I'm just swagging here, but I mean, this is probably more of a culture problem than a framework problem in terms of solution?
In general, yeah. I mean, DevSecOps and getting security in, it absolutely is. What we've seen in some of the best organizations that are doing this is security having to understand and taking the approach of making that road from the start of development into production as frictionless as possible.
Yeah.
That means enabling developers with better technologies, giving them, trusting them ultimately with more of what it is that we're going to do day to day from a security perspective. In fact, one organization in particular, Netflix, actually has kind of codified it in the term the paved road. And that's kind of their name for how they enable and trust developers. But then the flip side is the developers understand that there is an expectation that they are responsible for their code being delivered in a secure fashion.
Yeah, your one slide that kind of had culture at the center, I think communicated that well. Just an observation.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, is this something that you're seeing pretty widely implemented already? Or is this just starting to get a foothold?
This exact approach, I have not seen it getting implemented yet. It is something that I have been working with for about 8 months, to be completely open and honest. You know, I presented this for the first time last year at B-Side Chicago, which I believe was in October. I've actually, you know, I mentioned Adam Shostak's name before. He and I have actually been just recently in a little bit of a email conversation back and forth on some of this. My goal is hopefully at some point here in the fairly near future to publish a small paper on this, just some form of white paper, to try to really start to get it out there. The people I've talked to generally, you know, the idea of bringing threat modeling into the user story is a little novel, but it's also being well received. It might be a little early for some to accept that, but I think as we start to get it in front of some of the more, for lack of a better term, progressive organizations, those that were early adopters of DevOps, those that are very mature in a DevSecOps approach, I think for them, this is something that they're probably really ready to absorb and take with them, and you know, put it into their pipeline. The trick is, my personal belief, having worked in organizations of all sizes, you know, I think this actually simplifies a lot for some of those small and mid-sized businesses that are doing their own development, because it really brings an easy way to start building in security. So maybe if they can't do all of the things that we say you're supposed to do from a security perspective in your SDLC or in your delivery pipeline, this is one that I think is pretty effective very early on, just getting that threat modeling information out there and available for the developers early in their process.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to
Anything
take from
else?
silence that that's all the questions. But like I said, feel free to reach out. I am always happy to hear your ideas, answer other questions, or, you know, just chat about whatever.
Actually, I do have one more. Do you anticipate being involved in this implementation anywhere?
I hope so. So as I mentioned, I work for Sneak as an application security advocate. We certainly, you know, we eat our own dog food in terms of how we go about designing and delivering our software. You know, I think from that end, our tooling, our focus is definitely around developer enablement and the DevSecOps life cycles. And so I think from that perspective, I will have the opportunity to definitely work with a number of organizations who would see value and would want to implement this. So yeah, my hope is that I can definitely be a part of that, putting that into place at a particular organization where they've got that DevSecOps culture going.
Thank you. I'm excited to read this white paper.
Now I just got to write it.
Yeah.
Work's underway, and that's the important thing. So very cool.
Any other questions?
When's your book going to be out?
So the book, yeah, that's gonna be a fun one too. The book will be out, so it'll be available for what they call MEAP, which is basically an electronic, what would you call it? It's basically, it's more than an advanced purchase. It's actually advanced viewing. So after a certain number of chapters, they will release it electronically. That'll be available before Black Hat and DEF CON, assuming that Black Hat and DEF CON happen in August. The full book in print published will be available by February of next year.
Cool. Look forward to reading it.
I'm excited. I've gotten really good feedback. There's definitely a need for it. So
Yeah, that's probably like super excited over that, because I think millions of us have those questions.
yeah, I know with all the talk of skills gaps and on the flip side, hiring issues and all in between. Yeah, my hope is that I can hopefully help some people navigate those waters and find their way into a career.
Yeah, danke schön. Thank you.
All right. I want to say thank you very much for talking to us tonight. I know it's kind of hard to get everybody together, but it was really good, and I appreciate you talking with us tonight. And for everybody else that will be even more bored next week, we have Hacking with Tinkersecker, so that should be a good one, Wednesday next week. So thank you, everybody, for coming out, and have a good night.
Awesome. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.